I had an opportunity to meet with Michael a couple of weeks ago and go over what he was going to say and thinking of a response. It's not a point counterpoint, but it's trying to analyze the areas of where we can come together to work with what the whole ANFA idea is about. And neuroscience is a profession that is relatively new and growing at such a rapid rate, it's almost hard to really fathom it. And architecture is an ancient art that grows very, very slowly. Alice and I saw a bumper sticker on Sunday that said, "Save the Lemmings." And I think with the opportunity of working together with everyone in neuroscience and other sciences, we can be certain that it won't be Save the Architects on a license plate at some point in the future. I want to give, for those of you who haven't a limited knowledge of ANFA, just a brief background of how all this came together. When ANFA was strictly an idea, Allison, Fred Marks, John Eberhard, and I met at the Salk with 4 eminent neuroscientists. I tell people it was like a high school prom where the boys sit on one side and the girls sit on the other, but by late afternoon we were dancing. And we still are, and we're still dancing together. Rusty Gage forewarned us that we, the architects, would have to be more patient as the wheels turn much slower in the vast world of science. My son, he's 40 years old now, told me when he was contemplating his future that architecture was definitely not a choice because you have to wait so much time, almost a year, for your concepts to reach fruition. And that was long before Twitter and Facebook or even computers as we know them now. So patience is something I think we are learning. Results do take a long time, as does the requisite doctoral education. Michael comforted me with a comment that as long as we architects can reach the scientific American level of understanding, we can have, as President Obama would call it, a continuing conversation. And that's what we're having. Architecture appears to make quantum leaps, but in truth, it's mostly in the packaging. We have a slowly growing palette of materials, but measured in double digits, not millions and billions. And we use the same computers, but at less than 10% of their potential. And reinvent methods to do the same thing, albeit faster and with more accuracy. We discussed the diversity with regards to constructing an ANFA database as a starting point, but the realization that every variable conceivable from age, gender, ethnicity, cultural bias, and subjectivity would create a major, major task. But ANFA research offers a direction of a truly new way to design and build for an ever-increasing diverse population. I don't have a PowerPoint per se and very few images, which will explain some of the things I'm trying to get to. A memorable experience in our early years was a project that John Eberhard shared with us, the drawings of houses by preschool children from all parts of the world. They were nearly identical even when drawn by children from areas where the form did not exist in the built environment at all. Now, that's really good architecture. There's another one, amazing similarity. Rhoda Kellogg, 1987, examined 1 million drawings done by young children. The drawings represent the work of an estimated 10,000 children from 4 to 8 years old from over 30 countries. She said that one must assume that there are specialized areas in the brain where the patterns or passage of nerve impulses may be stored. The pattern of electrical potentials, those certain neurons and over their connecting fibers form a unit. Each passage of a stream of neural impulses leaves behind a persisting facilitation so that impulses may pass that way again with greater ease. So we're talking about a collective memory in architecture as well as that of the individual. In the design process, we seek to embody the common denominators that give rise to order and form, and concurrently, the elements that capture the identities of individuals and human social groups. So do we need or want intelligent buildings? There are abundant reasons, as Michael outlined. We also need intelligent people to design buildings and to occupy them, bearing in mind that comic Stephen Wright advises us that Half the people we know are below average. It's mathematically correct. Users will need to be trained to the level of driving a vehicle or staying up to date with a computer or whatever is the innovation du jour. When we explore the arena of intelligent buildings, the how exists as well as the blueprint for further development. The why is another issue. And to a large degree, where Michael leaves us with some very intriguing questions. The design industries are at the brink of learning a why never truly addressed before other than from intuition and with empirical data and resulting assumptions. The anticipation of human activities that could result from communication between the brain and the built environment are vast. When Michael and I were discussing this with specificity, I asked what happens in the same space when one partner is too cold, the other too hot, and the teenage son only dwells on this for nanoseconds amidst his plans for what to say to the opposite gender and when. The distant future may study this level of variables and materials, but the immediate and near future offers an operational system for less complex but extremely important interactive functions. To requote, the aim is to enhance the quality of life through reduction of stress, increased cognition, prolonged productivity, enhanced spiritual and emotional response. ANFA's original program, Beyond Intuition, clearly delineated buildings and the spaces that can be identified when the stated aims, done by a handful of creative architects and craftsmen, propelled by their own native genius at a different point in history. We learn from our forebears with appreciation and with visceral feelings. We attempt to describe why things were done, but just as the thousands of writers and critics that tell us what Shakespeare really thought, there still remains one Shakespeare who let his work speak for itself. Architects and those that appreciate the field have a lexicon of great buildings that we revere and study, the total being a minuscule percentage of what has been built in total. And architects tend to talk about architecture with a capital A and dismiss all other buildings as necessary but unimportant. Society tends to agree when we see the iconic architecture of the past still in existence, albeit with constant care of many patrons. The beautiful structure was for housing pigeons. This one being built in the near future is obviously for housing people in a hall. Very different, very beautiful, each in their own scale and in their own way. Imagine what awaits us, what neuroscience research offers us, even if only at the scientific American level. Not a prescriptive list of do's and don'ts, but a real-time understanding of client input, functionality, and human response to space in the environment, all beyond a budget and programmed spaces. The time is ripe to develop paradigms that deeply integrate neuroscientific insights into architectural design practice and create classrooms that impact the cognitive processes of children, hospital rooms, that impact the recovery rate of patients, and work environments that improve white-collar productivity, as well as other spaces that favorably impact the brain. In our very first meeting, Rusty referred to the architecture of the brain. You heard Michael use that term a lot tonight also, in a three-dimensional context. This one comment immediately created a shared view of the professions. People generally think of buildings as static, and when they imagine them, rarely understand the three-dimensionality of them. It is appreciated when walking through a space, or simply moving one's head to experience it, or just moving the eyes. All the senses are involved directly or indirectly. The brain activity to create an experience created space, as described by Michael, is almost incomprehensible to the layperson. The inhabited space he referenced in comparing the brain of the animal with the brain of the room and their interaction, a column of reassignable brains, is a step towards the real potential of neuromorphic architecture. The architecture of the Native Americans in Arizona is representative of a type of architecture that we study in depth. What do people do over a period of time when they have to deal with their environments in a way that is a collective memory, a collective imagination, and evolves over a long, long period of time. In a given area, the same thinking occurs, but it's done by different people over different times. As we look towards the same area of the country as Frank Lloyd Wright put together Taliesin West and Antion and Allen, the chapel in Sedona. Why do different volumes orchestrated create different emotional responses across the borders of cultures, wherever they be? Where do architects look first? Probably, as stated, in healthcare, learning, productivity, safety, and emergency response, the life safety and welfare mantra of NCARB, the National Council of Registration Boards, which gives us the examinations to practice. If investment and profit can be described in terms far beyond monetary reward, but is described by Steve Altman, the president at our school, as happiness, this opens a whole new forum of thinking. Happiness could be the experiential architecture of Calatrava. It responds to the daylight, the dawn, the evening, the building moves, it has many sensors. It could be designed by one person, designed by a field of people. It is a teamwork at its best, working before the operational input of the scientists that we have to work with in the future. It stands today as an outstanding example of what can be done. In architectural education today, we prepare students for the future in the framework of today. This is a fascinating project by Björk Engels of the firm BIG, who lectured here this week. And it is the Danish pavilion in Shanghai. And it is experience walking, riding a bicycle, standing still, sitting at various points as you move around, and it comes alive with different displays and visions of Denmark for the people in a totally different part of the world, and is totally populated constantly as the area is open. Björk showed a wonderful film of riding a bicycle through the entire area, and at no one point were you experiencing the same thing. It was constantly changing, just as the brain is constantly changing, and how you work with the inputs. And when you look at the building and in the building, it's different than when you're outside the building looking back at it. Today's research in neuroscience and the opportunity to work together is the harbinger of things to come. At New School of Architects, we are participating with ANFA and with Eduardo Macano at UCSD and wherever we can to develop new courses and programs to broaden the horizons for future architects. And with the groundwork established by Michael and his peers, it is a future that was never before imagined. Neuroscience has so much to research beyond the pathology of the brain, and together with computer science and ologies yet to emerge, will be as critical a working partnership as the engineer and other specialists that are part of our lives today. This is a section through the building that you saw at the end of Michael's section, and the architect that did that is here with us tonight. It's a beautiful example of an operational structure with, I don't know how many hundreds of sensors, Gordon, that deals with the environment and the people in it. And this is that same area in construction, and as we know it today. We in the architectural community have so much to learn working with the scientific community, and we like to feel that it is a learned experience that is mutual. We look forward to continually working with you now and in the future, and through working with ANFA, I feel this is entirely possible. And there was a time when you were trying to do something that was a little too difficult, and people would say, it's not rocket science. I think now you can say it's not neuroscience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Michael and Gil. So we have a few minutes for questions and answers. Tonight you've heard a little bit of insight into what it's like, the kind of discussions that we have within the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. Sometimes we dance really beautiful dances, and sometimes it's pretty difficult to get our legs untangled from underneath us. But I think this has given you a little bit of insight tonight. So I'd like to invite Michael and Gil to come back up and take just a few questions and answers. I think we have about 5 or 10 minutes left. Alison will go around with a microphone for anybody that has a question. So why don't you raise your hands, and she'll come by with a microphone.
You went over and over again how your scope is set at increasing comfort, livability, and to lower energy. Like that's sort of your the purpose for the academy, or your direction in design right now. And I feel like that's kind of a utopic vision. Like, how do you use neuroscience and the ability to, with neuroscience, to analyze complex systems to understand war or mental problems and things such as that? Do you guys see that as an opportunity more than trying to just make spaces that are nicer to deal with the complexity of cities, and how are you going to go about that?
In the broadest sense, there's an infinite number of variables that we'll be working with, and we're just touching the surface. We have a few courses in neuroscience that don't come even close to what Michael was discussing tonight, but being able to help students in the problem-solving mechanisms of how they work with architecture, and not just putting a building together, but discussing architecture from an urban design perspective, from the responsibility of what we do, and looking at the fact that I think we have a long time avoided the responsibility and been part of the problems that are on the planet right now. But working with the sciences, it's not just an engineering approach, it's looking at how each person can think about things differently in different cultures. What are the common denominators that we have to work together to solve, and what makes the resolutions of these things different in different parts of the world and in different 2 miles away from where you are right now. We're a long way from being there, but you have to start someplace.
Let me try a different answer. I think it's a little bit much to ask of either architects or neuroscientists to solve the problem of war. But I think mental health is something that we can approach both singly and together. Singly, a great deal of research is currently underway on what is going on in autism, schizophrenia, Alzheimer's disease, trying to understand what are the brain mechanisms that allow normal cognitive behavior, how do they go wrong, what can be done to treat them in terms of, for example, interference through the use of various drugs and other therapies. Where the partnership comes into play is to imagine how we can make hospitals and mental asylums, if you'll pardon the word, and places of this kind better environments in which recovery can take place in an environmental way. So the first is neuroscience working with clinicians, the second is neuroscience working with architects. But if you imagine that we could design an architecture such that Gaddafi would have turned out to be a sane, well-balanced individual who loves to look after his people, I'm afraid we're not going to manage it in the near future.
Thank you very much for this very interesting debate on how to make architecture intelligent, and I think this is, of course, a very important issue. Now we can think about the architecture of the future. And the future of humanity is an increasing number of people on the earth, an increasing population. And the experience of the past has, in architecture has been to put together in the same building as many people as possible. Le Corbusier, for instance, in France, has tried to pack human beings in his buildings using the modular as being, according to himself, the best way of packing people together. We can see all these buildings here. And there is, to my opinion, a real problem of how to manage the increased population of the world and the mental health of people within the buildings. In France, we had the experience of this architectures in the periphery of Paris where people were packed. And now this was a failure of the architects. And now they are putting down these buildings because people are becoming hostile to each other, crazy, fighting, and so on. And the social situation was extremely bad. I think here, and I agree with Michael, what he said just at the end and throughout his discussion, is to try to find way to have an environment which I may say are healthy at the level of the brain for individual people in such high density populations that we anticipate for the future. There are more and more people living in cities, if you look at what South America is showing to us. So what is the solution of architects for that?
I think one of the solutions is trying to rework what's happened historically. In previous centuries, buildings were built for purpose, to do some particular function at that point in time. Fortunately, they can change over time. And somewhere after the turn of the century and the start of the 20th century, buildings became a commodity, something you buy and sell, like corn futures or oil or anything else, because they were put up for a purpose, and that purpose was totally for profit for the people who were using them. And you could start off as an architect with one owner of a property, and then by the time you're finished, you could be the second or third person, depending on how it spins through the economy. But working with the other areas of science and people in the health community, and as you're referring to mental health, if we can readdress what the real purpose of what we do in this most ancient art for the betterment of humanity, this would be the first step. Not where its sole purpose. Its sole purpose is how much money it can make for its owner.
Let me just return to the two themes, the neuroscience of the architectural experience and the neuromorphic architecture. I think in the end, both will be involved. In other words, the neuroscience of the architectural experience is also an experimental science. After the Second World War, building those buildings seemed like a very good way to meet the needs of a large populace. We've learned that's wrong. Now we can go down a level from this large-scale social experiment to try to understand in detail how humans experience space in such a way that that was a failure and what can be done instead. The other aspect is a great deal of work is now being done on extending smart architecture to smart cities. China is looking at, I forget the exact figure, but it's maybe a building for 3 million people every 6 months or something. So how do you create that sort of organism? And then how to create a brain on that scale for a system, and then buildings with their brains within that scale, and then finally that it does meet the needs of the individual human. These are immense challenges which will require an immense amount of insight all the way from the social sciences through the neuroscientists to the work of architects and many other specialists as well.
There's one other thing I would add, is that within the social blight that I described, there are many truly great architects who understand the full gamut of what it needs to be done, and these are the people, these are the architects who are working not just with architecture as a building, but dealing with the social issues, dealing with hospitals that are not so far more than rooms in which people can stay there and get better, but get better quicker and in every way imaginable. And I have to say, as someone who's been teaching for a couple of decades, I am filled with optimism for the future, because I see today's students as being excellent students, and primarily because they're not just looking to get a degree and get a job, but most of them really think that in their position they can do something to make the world a better place. The first time in 10 years.
Good evening. My name is Manuel Alcina. I'm an architect in town. I have a quick question of Dr. Arbib and Dr. Gill as well. have you, or has the work that you're doing together engaged blind people, or maybe even blind people from birth, in the study of spatial relationships? And if you could comment on that.
I haven't personally. I have colleagues who've looked at blind people in terms of the cognitive science of how they appreciate space and what can be done to create spaces. But I don't know of factoring that into architectural design. We do have a blind institute here in San Diego. Perhaps the architect of that building has stories he could tell us, but I really don't know. Do you know about that?
No, but I would add that outside of the realm of neuroscience is that we were involved in developing an exhibit of architecture for blind students. And it was to study really what we don't think about very much, and that's the non-visual aspects of design and architecture, because every sense is involved in everything that we do. And it was a long labor and developed different types of spaces to move through, and every student moved through it could describe the kind of space that they walked through. And one other form of disability I would mention, and that is that when I was at Cal Poly, I had a student who was quadriplegic, and he could only move his head. And everyone said he would never make it, and he obviously couldn't draw, and he worked totally with a computer, which at that time was nowhere near as well designed as they are today, and he had a small blow tube and a few verbal commands. And the only way you could tell his work by the time he was a third-year student, it was usually the best in the class.
Well, for example, sound gives you very strong cues. The layout of gardens in terms of perfume can be very powerful for blind people. The issue of how do you do wayfinding, where you can perhaps feel a pathway with your foot or your cane rather than seeing it. What sort of texture can give you a cue as to where you are, and things of this kind. So these are all things that I know about as a cognitive scientist, but I have not yet explored with my architect colleagues.
Thank you, Eve Edelstein. I've had the fortune of working with ANFA. I'm a product of it in that I'm a neuroscientist and then did my architecture degree at New School. And so I wanted to offer some encouragement to the interesting questions, because I've had the opportunity to work with architects on real projects where we've actually taken some neuroscientific principles that have dealt with mental health, blindness, autism, and multiple developmental delays, and made changes to projects that are actually being built that will incorporate some of the principles that you spoke of and asked of, including how circadian rhythms affect the mental status of both staff and patients who live within hospitals, and all the way to how learning environments might be improved for movement and learning within those spaces. So we're beginning to see real science translated into real architecture.
If I may add, Eve is one of the people that was dubbed by John Eberhard as one of the pioneers, the people who really are getting educated in both areas, and the people who we be dependent on their future for teaching people in both areas. So thank you, Eve.
So if I may, just to finish up before we thank Michael and Gil for such great presentations, I'd like you to note that our next speaker will be Tom Albright. Tom is ANFA's current vice president. He's the director of the Vision Center Laboratory at the Salk Institute of Biological Sciences, and he was recently awarded the brand new Conrad T. Prebys Chair in Vision Research at Salk Institute. His talk will be entitled Vastu Veda in the Age of Neuroscience, and I told Tom I wished I had come up with that title. The response that night will be from our own beloved John Eberhard, FAIA, whose wisdom was at the center of the creation of the Academy. This lecture will be held at the Salk Institute on April the 20th. And you can see the full lecture series on the board at the back of the room. And I just want to give you sort of a tickler for the final lecture, because at that lecture you'll have, if you make your reservation in time, you'll have the opportunity to tour the cave at Cal IT 2, which is the center of some of this research to which Eve is referring. So with that, I would like to thank Michael and Gil for great presentations. I think you've given everybody some insight into the kind of discussions that we've started to have at ANFA. Obviously, we've got a long way to go, and we hope that you will all be part of that discussion on a continuing basis. You can visit our website at www.anfarch, that's ANFARCH.org, and we hope to see you at the next lecture. Thank you, Michael and Gil.
Scientist. I tell people it was like a high school prom where the boys sit on one side and the girls sit on the other, but by late afternoon we were dancing. And we still are, and we're still dancing together. Rusty Gage forewarned us that we, the architects, would have to be more patient as the wheels turn much slower in the vast world of science. My son, he's 40 years old now, told me when he was contemplating his future that architecture was definitely not a choice, because you have to wait so much time, almost a year, for your concepts to reach fruition. And that was long before Twitter and Facebook or even computers as we know them now. So patience is something I think we are learning. Results do take a long time, as does the requisite doctoral education. Michael comforted me with a comment that as long as we architects can reach the scientific American level of understanding, we can have, as President Obama would call it, a continuing conversation. And that's what we're having. Architecture appears to make quantum leaps, but in truth, it's mostly in the packaging. We have a slowly growing palette of materials, but measured in double digits, not millions and billions. And we use the same computers, but at less than 10% of their potential. And reinvent methods to do the same thing. Architecture is an ancient art that grows very, very slowly. Alice and I saw a bumper sticker on Sunday that said, "Save the Lemmings." And I think with the opportunity of working together with everyone in neuroscience and other sciences, we can be certain that it won't be "Save the Architects" on a license plate at some point in the future. I want to give, for those of you who haven't a limited knowledge of ANFA, just a brief background of how all this came together. When ANFA was strictly an idea, Allison, Fred Marks, John Eberhard, and I met at the Salk with 4 eminent neuroscientists. I had an opportunity to meet with Michael a couple of weeks ago and go over what he was going to say, and thinking of a response. It's not a point-counterpoint, but it's trying to analyze the areas of where we can come together to work with what the whole ANFA idea is about. And neuroscience is a profession that is relatively new and growing at such a rapid rate, it's almost hard to really fathom it. And architecting, albeit faster and with more accuracy. We discussed the diversity with regards to constructing an ANFA database as a starting point, but the realization that every variable conceivable from age, gender, ethnicity, cultural bias, and subjectivity would create a major, major task. But ANFA research offers a direction of a truly new way to design and build for an ever-increasing diverse population. I don't have a PowerPoint per se and very few images, which will explain some of the things I'm trying to get to. A memorable experience in our early years was a project that John Eberhard shared with